We'd like to welcome all of you. We understand that this year was unique given the COVID-19 crisis and our need to cancel our 25th annual actual conference. And so we'd love to welcome you to Elevate How We Evaluate, our virtual summer conference series. My name is Felicia Clark, and I also have Molly here, my colleague on the MAE board. We'd like to start out by sharing a few housekeeping matters, and then we'll get started with our introduction. We do have everyone muted, and so we're asking that if you do have any questions, that you post your questions in the chat box. We will address those questions at the end of the series. Also, we are recording this session, and so we will make it available later alongside slides. We will be sending out a survey at the end, and we'll also have a few more announcements at the end of the session. Additionally, I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for joining our MAE 2020 Virtual Conference Summer Series. Today, we'd like to introduce Dr. Ebony Reddock. She'll be presenting on equitable evaluation. We'd also like to note that this workshop will introduce participants to two approaches to embedding equity in your evaluation design. Specifically, participants will learn how to assess and account for structural inequities in the design of their evaluations. We'd like to once again welcome Dr. Ebony Reddock. She will have breakout rooms and also a very exciting presentation for all of you. And I'll just end here and allow Ebony the opportunity to share more about her presentation. So I will stop sharing our screen now.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. Before I share my screen, I just wanted to say thank you for coming. And so my background in equitable evaluation is originally as a health scientist. I was trained as a health scientist, but with a particular emphasis on health disparities research. So this work is near and dear to my heart. I started as a health educator and somehow, as probably the story of many of you, fell into evaluation in the process of doing something else and finding that I loved and appreciated this work. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of my learnings with you today. And I'll say this again at the end, but always happy to chat if you have questions. I collect resources, so if you ever want resources, just let me know. So I will go into sharing my screen. Let's see, and then I will go into, all right. So you should all be able to see, all right. We had technology. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. We, as you probably can see, we are in a moment. And so as evaluators, and for those in the audience who are not practicing evaluators, our guests, we all have a unique opportunity to shine a light and promote social change through our evaluative lens. So let's jump in, right? So what we're doing today, so this session will be split up into three basic sections. I'll start it by talking through some of the principles of equitable evaluation. I will talk about equitable evaluation in practice, and then we'll just have some space for small group work. Please know that today is an appetizer. So equitable evaluation is a rich practice. So I hope that what you hear will motivate you to learn more. When we send the slides, and I also have a handout, there will be some resources on there, but there are a lot more. And there are a lot more people practicing this work. So I hope that when you walk away, you'll have a basic understanding of this work and a basic framework for thinking about your evaluative process. So some norms have already been shared. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat. We'll have some time at the end to respond to those questions. If you are able, please show yourself. I know we don't always like to show ourselves, but especially in a small group, if you can have your video going, that would be great. Some group norms, and again, especially relevant to the small group since you'll be spending some time there. You know, treat each other with dignity and respect. You may be with people you don't know, but I'm asking you to be vulnerable and trust that the issues that you discuss will be kept in confidence, and that people are coming with their best selves, their best understanding. And so I also encourage you too to participate. I want to start by giving some framing definitions for our discussion today. So there are a lot of ways in which we frame equity, in particular racial ethnic equity. And just know that that will be kind of our frame for today in terms of, as I talk about equity, I will talk about it in the context of race and ethnicity, because that's where a lot of the work has happened. And that doesn't mean that this does not apply to other social inequities, such as those related to ability, sexual identity, et cetera, et cetera. But because the work that I'm referencing focuses on race and ethnicity, I will be leaning on that. So as for framing definitions, the first is an outcome. So in terms of equity, we talk about that the ultimate outcome is that race and ethnicity is not a predictor of the course of a person's life. But we also think about equity in terms of a process, and specifically that those who are most impacted by structural inequities are meaningfully, and I'm stressing that word, involved in the creation and implementation of policies and practices that govern their lives. And so we, you know, in our field, we talk a lot about engagement, and so we vary in terms of how we talk about that and what we mean when we talk about that. So I want to stress that intensive engagement is a big part of equitable evaluation practice. So the roots of evaluation are in social science. And if you're interested in learning more about the history of evaluation, I'm happy to share some resources. But for today, what I want to stress is that what that means is that it's part of structural systems that shape our experience and lives. And what that means is that, like everything in these systems, it can be used to either promote equity or maintain the social inequities that we are seeing today. So part of embedding equity into evaluation is acknowledging as well as challenging the ways in which white supremacy culture shapes the evaluation process, right? Including the process and the outcomes that emerge from it. So I want you to just think about some of the ways that you were either taught to be researchers or evaluators, or learned about evaluation as you went along the way. So for example, we're taught that there's only one valid way of looking at something, which typically means that, excuse me, that the trained and objective scientific eye that we were taught is important, but is an eye that's rooted in Western white value system. We're taught to emphasize quantity, and specifically quantitative data. And we're also taught, for example, to value writing up our learnings in peer-reviewed journals that aren't accessible by the larger community, including some of the people who are working on the front lines to address the issues written about in the peer-reviewed journals. And so equitable evaluation in its roots is really about challenging those paradigms. So these three, the next three kind of frames that I will share actually come from the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. And so just know in terms of readings and learnings, this the Equitable Evaluation Initiative is a very valuable resource for you to learn more. But for today, I want to share some of the three major principles. So one, equitable evaluation as a field believes that this work should be in the service of equity. And so what that means is that it changes who evaluation is conducted for. So we often think about, oh, well, we need to make sure that, you know, our funders are getting the evaluation products they want, the clients that hired us and organizations, the board of directors. But what equitable evaluation does is that it places beneficiaries and the achievement of equity at the center of evaluation work. The use of the word beneficiaries is also very deliberate, in contrast to other words for community members participating, such as participants, customers, clients. The idea of a beneficiary emphasizes that we're doing this work in service of the needs and desires of community members. They are the ones who benefit, and they are the ones who are at the center of that work. The second principle is that evaluative work can and should answer critical questions, particularly in terms of changing what evaluation is conducted for. So rather than focusing the evaluation scope only on traditional evaluation outcomes such as fidelity, program process, immediate participant outputs, equitable evaluation seeks to learn more about the impact of historical and structural decisions on outcomes, effects on programs on different populations, as well as how program outcomes contribute to broader drivers of inequity. So it's a little different of a frame, right? Because we're very used to thinking about how many people were served, how well were they served, and in particular thinking about counting that. But for many of us, we also realize as we're doing this work that there's a larger context, and we don't know how to consider it in our work and write about it in our work. But equitable evaluation seeks to actually take that context and make it a central part of what we talk about in terms of learning about programs and policies. So the third principle is that evaluative work should be designed and implemented commensurate with the values underlying equity work. So what this means basically is that equity infuses evaluation design. And some ways that we'll talk about later include participatory approaches, as well as multicultural validity, which again is something that is central to equitable evaluation work. I won't get too much into it, but hopefully it will spark some interest in what that means in terms of validity having different meanings and thinking about it more broadly than the way we look at it now. While a cultural responsive lens and an equity lens are complementary, they are not the same thing. A cultural responsive lens means that you are attuned to ensuring that elements of evaluation reflect a cultural group or cultural groups that are the subject of your work. So for example, in a presentation about evaluation results, we would make sure that the photos represent local ethnic groups such as Somalian or Korean populations, or we would make sure that if we are working in a neighborhood where the predominant language is Spanish, that their surveys in Spanish. An equity lens is attuned to ensuring that the evaluation process and outcomes purposely promote equity. So if we're in a community, for example, where there are concerns and issues related to immigration and how that's enforced, part of our lens is thinking about, is what I'm doing promoting inequity? So for example, am I gathering data that might even accidentally make community members vulnerable to being picked up by ICE? And so it goes beyond ensuring that a group is represented to ensuring that the process and outcomes are aiming to dismantle or challenge the structures that create inequity. So I'm a reflector. I'm a learner and a reflector. And so I like to have some basic questions when I'm thinking about my work. And I'll revisit these again at the end, but some basic questions that you can ask yourself to start thinking about this. Who are the beneficiaries of either our, if you're an internal evaluator, or their services, if you're an external? What are the structural forces that perpetuate inequities in their lives? How does serving them through programming help dismantle injustices in the structural systems? And how can I use evaluation to serve that, to really work toward dismantling inequities? So I want to pause and get some initial reactions. So we are going to switch over to a Mentimeter poll. If you've never used that before, go to the website, type in www.menti.com and enter the code. Or if you would rather, you can actually scan the QR code on the screen with your photo app if you have a smartphone, and that will take you to the site. And so I'm going to switch the site myself. So I don't know if everybody see that website? Oh, I'm looking at Felicia and Molly to tell me if you can see that. Okay. All right. So getting some in, it's important but difficult. That's a good question. Does this apply to all evaluations? I think that's a good question that I have my answer, but also acknowledge that there are situations in which that can be difficult to embrace, right? That there's sincerity involved. I need to move my own little screen of faces. I'm happy to see the questions to ask ourselves. It's hard to know if we are evaluating appropriately in this respect. I like the reflective questions. I should have had this, amen to that. I should have had this lens many years ago. I felt the same way when I learned about it. No bad thoughts, but see conflict in changing who the eval is for, because if you're hired as a client by a client, you have to work for the client. You can't focus so much on the population your client doesn't receive what they're looking for. And that's a very valid point. And that's probably like a equity in evaluation 102. Some of us in the group, I recognize the names, are part of an evaluation collaboratory where we're learning about this practice. And we talk a lot about that, about how do you balance who it's for when you're being paid by a client. And I know that not only myself, but some of them would love to chat about that. Thinking about our role as an intermediary to push this framework and mind shift set with funders. So that's another reason why I would refer people to the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. A lot of that is about building a network of people who are ready to push that work forward. What does it look like in action? That's actually a good segue, person who wrote, what does that look like in action? So I'm going to use that to transition to the next part of the presentation. So I encourage you to kind of keep, this will keep rolling. So if you're interested, keep looking at those. All right. Because the next part of the session is about what are some ways that we can actually put this into action. Again, this is an intro. So what I'll share are basically some ideas, but there's definitely different ways that you can more areas for learning. Let me put it that way. So I want to start by thinking about how do we apply an equity list to our learning. I tend to think about evaluation as a systematic way of learning about work, about someone's work. And so in terms of thinking about an equity lens in that, we can turn our attention to particular areas of inquiry and learning, right? So we can think about how an organization is building an equity focus into the whole organization, which is actually something that I'm seeing rise or being lifted up a lot right now by foundations, by organizations, which is awesome. Systems change, learning about the systemic barriers that create inequities. There's also targeted equity. Diversity and inclusion, as well as equality as part of an equity lens, which is really about improving access to services for all populations. The framing paper that I have referenced in this slide will actually goes into detail about those. So I encourage you to look those up. And again, you'll get a handout with the links as well. So the next pieces of our talk will reference this particular white paper or working paper, how to embed a racial and ethnic equity perspective in research. It is by far probably the document I reference the most when I'm thinking about practice. And so I encourage you to get it, print it out, learn it, memorize it, sleep with it, I don't care, but it's a really good reference. So the first thing that you should know is that evaluation methods can also be more equitable. And that's across the board. So from landscape assessment, design, analysis to dissemination, which is generally how we think about our process, planning to dissemination. So landscape assessment is also known by other names: discovery, evaluation planning, starting the evaluation. But essentially what it means is it's a process of exploring and documenting the context in which the evaluation study will operate. And so with the equity lens, there are many things that you can do. Probably the easiest to grasp on is to really explore your context. Who holds the power in this situation? Who's affected by the program that you're evaluating? You can also clarify apparent issues by collecting background data, not just from our favorite sources like the census or American Community Survey or Data Driven Detroit or, you know, some library somewhere with some peer-reviewed articles. But you can also clarify apparent issues by speaking with community members before you even start designing the evaluation. Another thing that you can do is identify root and causal factors of interest. And you can do that in conjunction with community members. In some versions of this workshop that I've done, we actually go through a root causes activity. So if that's of interest to you, there's an example in the child trends article. Next phase is design and data collection. Or all chances are pretty familiar with what that means in terms of creating the research study and gathering information pertaining to research questions. So in doing that with an equitable lens, some things that you can do, develop equitable research questions that include inquiry about structural factors. That's a great way that if you're challenged with how to include structural factors within your reporting and your dissemination, have some questions that actually that inquire about them so that they are something that you're attuned to. Identify or develop data collection instruments that are validated with diverse populations. We often are, you know, quick to reach for scales or measures that show up in peer-reviewed articles, but how about we take, you know, we can take the time to look to see, was this actually validated with a community that will be receiving it? Or you can even develop data collection instruments that are more relevant to the community that you're serving. And so that would kind of lead into facilitating the development of instruments created through participatory methods. And that's a great way, again, to promote engagement. And so notice that there's a thread of engagement through this entire process where you know, you may be engaging in the landscape assessment process, you're engaging in the design and data collection process. You know, I would say a good kind of short way to think about it is that the earlier the better. Just like you would involve a client, traditional client at the beginning, where can you start involving community members? Data analysis, you can also engage in data analysis. Analysis through participatory methods. Some of you may be familiar with data parties, member checking, participatory data analysis. If you're a utilization focused person, you know data interpretation meetings. So you can ask that not only that the client is at the data interpretation meeting, but also beneficiaries of the program or service. Data interpretation and context. So using context to explain trends. So for example, if you're seeing a trend that that it seems that for the actually, I'm just going to skip the example because I think I was trying to come up with one off the top of my head. And exploring stratifications through intersections of social identity categories. So a good example is there may be a program that is having a disproportionate negative impact on Arabic women, but not Arabic men. But if you don't do that intersection of gender and ethnicity, you may not pick up on that disproportionate negative impact. And that can surprisingly be difficult. I've had experience where I've tried to do stratification through those intersections and found myself challenged in explaining why it was important to get enough data, enough of a sample size to be able to do that work. So these things I'm saying them, but they're not easy. Just know that. But there are lots of things that you can do to continue to move toward having a more equitable lens in your work. Finally, dissemination. So doing that work with an equity lens, some things that you can do when you're thinking about the audience for the evaluation results. We often think about, what does the client want? What does their funder want? And this doesn't mean not to include those, but also to think about beneficiaries. What information would be most useful? What platforms are preferred? Using information that can reach decision makers, for example, community leaders, other change makers who can use information for program and policy change. So encouraging as an evaluator that your client bring other people to the table who may find this information relevant. Promoting equitable messaging, so watching out for victim blaming or victim saving. That's something I'm from a public health background, very common to do victim blaming and victim saving. And then promoting the sustainability of program and related services and businesses. I recently worked with an organization that does farmers market. So I talked to them about making sure that the results that they were using would actually help the farmers continue to promote and build their businesses. So those are some ideas in landscape assessment, data collection and design, analysis, and dissemination. So what we're going to do is I'm going to move you into some small groups. And so you'll be randomly placed into one of 8 groups. Groups 1 and 5, I would like you to focus on landscape assessment. So make a note of your group number. 2 and 6, I'd like you to focus on design and data collection. Group 3 and 7, data analysis. And then group 4 and 8, dissemination. If one of the group members can just share an example of a recent evaluation or program design, if you're not evaluators, project, and then a task that falls under the group topic. So, if you're in group 1, a task that you did that was related to landscape assessment. And so as a group, I would like you to discuss, how does the task adopt an equitable evaluation approach? What is one way that the task could be adapted to be more equitable? What do you see as the benefits of the adaptation, and how will it benefit program beneficiaries as well as contributing to dismantling inequities? Just for time's sake, we won't do a report out, but I encourage you, if you want to continue talking after this, please continue talking. So I'm going to look to Molly to split people off in groups, and then we'll spend 10 minutes there, and then we'll come back for questions. And as people come back, I will, when it gets to be a little bit more, I'll go back to what you call it.
Your slides. Yep, looks like we're up to 7 participants. People are slowly coming in.
Part of me is nosy, so to everyone coming back, I'm paying attention to the art in your background because I love art. I'm like, yay, Zoom, I get to see people's art in their offices.
Oh, it's great.
That's secretly why I want people on screen, so I can look at their rooms.
Okay, I think that's
everybody. Okay. So welcome back, everybody. I want to make sure we have time for questions, but is there at least 1 or 2 groups that might want to share what they talked about? I said I wasn't gonna report out, but I can't help it. I'm so nosy. I'm just so nosy. I'm sorry.
If you would like to speak, feel free to type your name into the chat and I will unmute you.
Well, I'll just quickly speak. Maybe that'll get the ball rolling. For group 3, our focus was on data analysis. And so Amanda and I discussed a little bit about how we share out data and also in analyzing and just making sure that you're parsing out data appropriately to cover socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and other background information, but also in reviewing qualitative data, that those themes are also representative of the population. And then in sharing, although that's a dissemination group, we did find that when you're analyzing data that you must be cognizant of what will happen upon sharing it. And so that analysis, if it can be participatory or inclusive, or if you can involve the program or respondents that are represented to some degree, they could at least get some understanding of the data and how it will be presented and shared with others. And so that could be very beneficial in analyzing narrative data or other types of qualitative data.
I appreciate you lifting up the idea that there are outcomes or consequences to the work that we do, and we as evaluators we're not all seeing, you know. So it's important that in terms of doing this work equitably, that we're being inclusive in terms of engagement, so that we are learning those things, those consequences, because we don't know. And I think the fact that we might think we know is kind of a result of being in a white supremacist culture where you're supposedly the expert. We all, you know, have to fight that in our work.
We have someone else who has agreed to share. I believe you are unmuted.
Yeah, hi. I'm Sam Larson, and I was with Colleen Mackey, and we had the question about landscape, and we both said, oh no, that's not the question we wanted to answer. But what we talked about is that from a landscape is that we have oftentimes approached our work from, this is the given starting point, and we don't go in and question that given starting point from a landscape perspective, pushing back a little bit in terms of where the funder is starting the conversation and to broaden that out. And so that was, you know, we found examples in our own work where we could have pushed back, we could have redefined things slightly to look at a slightly different landscape than was given to us. And that's part of, I think, that funders are much more receptive now to that push on landscape than maybe what they have been in the past.
See, this is why I like to hear from people. I love that idea of thinking about where being placed into a particular standpoint, and thinking, because that even helps me in, you know, right now starting some projects. Now I'm asking myself the question, you know, from where I'm starting, was I given that standpoint, or you know, am I challenging myself to move beyond that standpoint? If you're a theory person, there's a theory called standpoint theory. It's an old one by Patricia Hill Collins that talks about, you know, where you are in terms of your identity informs what you see. And so I love that. So thank you for sharing. Yeah, I like doing workshops because I also learn. And I just like to share what I've learned and see how people are learning from it. So I'll go back to the slide just to end, and then we'll have time for questions. Equitable evaluation is challenging. I mean, we were only in the small groups for 10 minutes, but you know, even in the Mentimeter comments, we all talked about how challenging that work is, but it is critical because, again, we're part of structural systems. And so we can either promote equity, push for equity, or we can maintain inequity. And the awesome opportunity we have right now means that people are open and thinking about how to challenge inequities. So it's critical that we are willing to engage in that work. And so just, again, to summarize, equitable evaluation changes who evaluation is conducted for, what it's conducted for, and how it's conducted. And just, hearkening back to the reflective questions that you can ask yourself in your practice. Here are some resources. I want to lift up the dismantling racism because I failed to lift it up when I was talking about white supremacy, culture, and evaluation. But you will also get this in a handout right after the session. So questions? Back to not sharing anymore. So questions.
Ebony, we did have one question pop into the chat in terms of do you have resources or instruments that measure root and causal factors?
So there are instruments that measure root and causal factors. Some of them will be referenced in that child trends paper. There's also, some of you may be familiar with the 5 whys activity or even the root cause activity. I think the root cause activity is in the child trends paper as well, but I can share those. If the 5 whys is not in the child trends, I can share that. That's used, I've seen it used in collective impact work as well. And so I apologize, I realized I actually didn't share my screen. I just started talking, but there was nothing there other than what I said, I promise.
Any other questions?
I have one. So one of the things we talked about in our group was the tension between having this lens and sometimes where you run up against funders, requirements, or deadlines. And one of the things I shared is trying to, so one of the programs I am the evaluator for is statewide, and we try to be intentional about doing focus groups with the beneficiaries, I love that term, rather than participants, regularly to get their voice. And I'm trying to be better about, whether it's a survey or focus group, sharing the results with the participants themselves, because oftentimes it's used as, to put into our report to our funder, but there's not this like closed loop. But that takes time, and having to turn things around quickly or having to conduct multiple focus groups and stuff, it's challenging. And so I'd love to hear you talk about how do you, because our funders don't have this lens, and my funder tends to be CDC. They don't have this lens when it comes to programming in general, and certainly not in evaluation. So how do you kind of work with that?
So, that is a complicated question because in some ways, depending on who your initial clients are, you're working to change a system and a culture on top. So some suggestions that as an individual evaluator that I would suggest, showing how these structural factors are driving the problems that they have, determined are problems, so that, they can see conceptually why it's important to think about those. Finding champions is probably by far the most powerful thing that you can do. As an evaluator, especially an external evaluator, we're outside of the system. But if you can find a champion who's willing to move that forward and that discourse forward, is helpful. And then from a bigger standpoint, really being part of initiatives and movements to change how evaluation is seen is probably another thing that, I mean, it's outside of you. I mean, outside of the project, but it's important because ultimately that's what's going to move the field, if that makes sense. So I encourage you to kind of get involved with associations. If there's initiatives, like for example, we have a Southeastern Michigan Equitable Evaluation Work Group where we talk about these issues as well. So from the project level, find a champion, justify why, and then from a professional standpoint, get involved and engaged.
Thank you.
Ebony, we have another question for you. It is, I appreciate the focus on structural issues. It takes the focus deeper and can lead to lasting change. Thank you for this session. Already seeing how you changed my work. So I take it back, not a question, but a comment to you.
Well, thank you. And I will say that, like, from even from, our short time together, I've even learned some things. So I appreciate that. And I think that it's important we continue to just learn from each other and promote this work. So thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. There is an actual evaluation link in the chat. So you can actually grab that link if you'd like to complete the short evaluation of this web series. We'll also send it via email to those that were registered. Additionally, we have on the screen other series that are coming up. But more importantly, we'd love to thank Dr. Reddock for your presentation. It's very helpful. I think this conversation is ongoing, and so I do agree that the advice to join groups or get involved professionally in this conversation is essential. So we'd love to thank you for your time. We really appreciate you, and we appreciate all of you for joining this morning. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm excited for these other sessions, so I'm like,